thing, if we're table setting for this discussion, the first thing to note is we've already seen Alabama win this game. And that's what I said before to somebody on Twitter who was like, what happens if Alabama beats Georgia? And I'm like, look, Alabama's Alabama. It's not like little old, we're not doing the Clemson thing. Like, it's not little old Alabama. It's Alabama. But they needed to show it first. And now that they've shown it, I can give them credit for something that I think that they can do. There's going to be overreactions on both sides. People are going to overreact and say, I saw Alabama beat the absolute crap out of Georgia in Atlanta. I'm going with Alabama because it's going to happen again. And I do think in rematches, it's like something around 60%, the team that won wins again. Even though everybody says it's hard to win again, it usually is the team that won the first time. On the flip side, everybody's going to say, I saw Alabama kind of struggle offensively without Mechie against Cincinnati. And I think Michigan's a better team, which I'm not sure they are. And I saw what Georgia did. Georgia's going to be favored. I'm going with Georgia because they absolutely killed Michigan. And I think there's going to be overreactions on both sides. For me, Josh, the thing that brings it all back to the middle is I feel a little uncertain about picking Alabama in this game because of all the injuries, especially if Ekiyor is not ready to go and Owens is hurt. Like, he was helped off the field. So that's 2 offensive linemen on a shaky offensive line. If those guys are healthy, though, what we saw in Alabama versus Georgia is that offensive line wasn't overmatched to the point where they couldn't run their offense. So we went into that Georgia game thinking what we saw against Auburn means they're not going to be able to run their offense, which means they don't really even have a puncher's chance. I think that kind of recenters everything, but beyond that, I don't know. So I want you to get into the injury situation for Alabama and let me know, without giving your score, if that is getting to the point where it's just kind of insurmountable.
I already talked about in our game recaps that I think there's a trade-off basically between losing Mechie and losing Robinson, or getting Robinson back. That in the Georgia game, they had Mechie. They fell off a lot when Mechie came out. I think Mechie, it's not so much that he's a better receiver as he is a different one. He presents a different kind of receiving threat, his ability to get open in short yardage. But you actually have a healthy tailback. And against Cincinnati, it was crucial to have a healthy tailback. Whereas I think against Georgia, you'd rather have a great receiver, especially in short yardage, that can help you against the blitz or at least try to stave it off. But I still think in general, that stuff's just sort of a trade-off because they've lost in one area, but they've gained a whole other side of the offense that was extremely limited in the original game. I think the bigger issue is the injuries at corner and injuries at offensive line. I don't know how bad the offensive line injuries are going to be. But what we saw in the middle of the year is Alabama with a beat-up offensive line was not particularly effective. Now, when they've got McLaughlin in at center, for whatever reason, they really are playing better than they did when they had Dalcourt in at center. I don't know that the right side of the line was so good that it necessarily feels like a huge drawback. But I will say when Owens was not starting against Auburn, it was an absolute turnstile. And he kind of resettled it. So he seems like a not great option to the best of what they had. So I think injuries, the offensive line are major. Again, we already talked about the corner situation. I think the corners might be a liability, but I didn't see any reason for that against Cincinnati. And my guess is, given the pedigree of the guys they have and the crazy depth at corner, I think it's more like what happened with LSU, where they lose a bunch of corners, but they had a safety issue at LSU. They didn't have a corner issue, and they had corners that stepped up. I think the concern for Alabama might be injuries in offensive line, combined with the fact that, and this is really where I want to turn the conversation, I can't see Georgia approaching this game the same way they did the first time. And they were happy to use their standard defense and standard rush schemes. They attack Alabama more with power than speed. And Alabama's offensive line has had trouble with speed rushers. Cincinnati had a first-round draft pick level outside rusher, and he's going to go early rounds in Myjai Sanders. And Alabama struggled with him. Georgia does not have that kind of player now that Adam Anderson is out. But they can at least bring their inside linebackers like Nakobe Dean and line them up outside and just just blitz a ton, which is what Alabama struggled with, and I don't think they did enough of in the first game. And if they do that, I think the injury issue becomes more of an issue. So sort of as a segue, do you think Georgia approaches this game differently? And if they do, how does that start to change the conversation to make this more than just, hey, we're going to get the same result that we had last time?
Yeah, I think they do. And I think that Kirby, even if I remember correctly, at the halftime, interview against Alabama, I think he even mentioned that they weren't blitzing enough. And so after seeing, we've got the LSU result, the Auburn result, and now the Cincinnati result, where Cincinnati runs a 3-3-5, but they never just sent three guys. They never did rush through drop eight, never. And I think that they're going to send more guys. The question is, and we haven't seen this a lot, that leaves a secondary that got, so I'm going to flip this right back to you. That Georgia secondary got cooked in a situation where they weren't sending a bunch of guys. So does this game come down to the question of whether or not Georgia gets home versus the Alabama with their, blitzing guys, versus now guys that were getting cooked when they're dropping 7 are now even more on an island? Does it just come down to the fact that can Alabama exploit that? And if they can't, they lose. If they can, they win.
I think that's probably the simplest path to either team winning the game, right? I still saw some of the same problems we'd seen before. Darian Kendrick against Michigan, as much as they were dominating that game, got lost a few times. And he made some big plays, but Kendrick's problem has always been that he was a great athlete, dating back to his times at Clemson. And there are times where his technique just breaks down completely, times where he gets turned around, and he lets guys loose. And I saw that, but Michigan was just never in a position, nor do they have the athletes to exploit it. Alabama's a lot more better positioned to do that. And it'll be interesting to see, like Alabama did a lot of stuff attacking the perimeter with short throws, like screens. And they only threw deep really a handful of times. I think in this game, Georgia is going to play a lot more press. They're going to play a lot more aggressive. They're going to risk getting burned a lot more than they did in the first game. And they're going to see if Alabama does something they've done a lot, which is, hey, we're going to play almost cover 0, carry your receivers, and see if Bryce Young panics. Or I say panics, whether he trusts his pocket is probably a better way to put it, long enough to throw it if a guy does come open. I frankly, I don't have the answer to that. I can take guesses towards it. My inclination is that Alabama hits some and not others. We run our model, we do our predictions, we don't do it based off Vegas. We say this all the time, but we bring up Vegas sometimes because it's an interesting way to sort of flesh out these concepts. Georgia's favored by 3. Everybody knows that. It's interesting because it seems like most people are picking Alabama, even though Georgia's favored. That is usually not a good sign for the team that everybody's picking. When Georgia's getting points and not getting picked, that usually means Vegas knows something we don't. And I think the most telling stat that was not the line, it's the over/under at 52.5. Vegas does not think this is going to be a high-scoring game. They think this is going to be a game that's like 24-27. And if that's the case, that means Vegas doesn't think that Alabama is likely to be overly explosive in this game. They think this could be, and again, the majority of Alabama's big games, their offensive line has not held up. And Bryce Young has lost confidence in his line, and his receivers has not really been able to either have time to throw the ball down the field or trusted that he would have time long enough to stay in the pocket and throw it. I think sometimes it's a height issue where he can't see the guys downfield. So if Georgia is a lot more aggressive, I do think I'm not saying it necessarily right now that's going to make them win, but for this stage of our discussion, I definitely think it means it's not going to be a situation where Alabama's in a position to put up 50. I think if they play a lot more aggressively, it is going to make this a tighter game.
Well, you mentioned Vegas, you mentioned model. Let's real quick tell everybody what the model said. And look, y'all, there's been some weird bowl stuff that's happened with opt-outs here and there, but we've got some tight data points with Georgia and Alabama playing one another, and then with, Alabama and Georgia both played teams who weren't opting out. So that helps too. But Josh, why don't you, now that I've teed it up, why don't you talk about the model?
Sure. And, you've already seen a model when we did the original game. It was 28 all Alabama and Georgia. Um, and now we turn it over. We've played a couple more games. And notably, our model is also based off who you played and how they've done. And there's more data for all the other opponents that's shifted stuff a little bit. And what's interesting to me is it has shifted it towards Alabama. It's now Alabama 29, Georgia 26. Just like before, there is a yardage advantage in Georgia's favor, but it was 6 yards per play predicted for Georgia to 4.5 in the prior model, even though it was even. Now it's pulled a lot closer. It's 5.6 to 4.9. So you went from about a yard and a half advantage to about zero point 0.7 yards. Basically, Georgia's yardage production advantage has been cut in half in just really a combination of 2 games and the performance in those 2 games. And also all the additional data points, the bowl games in particular for everybody they played, kind of made Alabama look a little bit better, which is sort of an interesting side note. Our game does not care or even really is not designed to be made aware of the fact that this is a rematch, just FYI. You can say that that's really important. There's reasons we don't do that. Football in particular is not a sport where if teams play 10 times in a row that you tend to get the same result that often. The same team may win, like Daniel was saying, 60% of the time, but the way the game flows tends to be pretty different. I think the more notable aspect really is in how some of the numbers have slid defensively, and this is why stuff tightened for Alabama. Alabama's pass defense number went from 92% against Georgia down to 88. Georgia's pass defense number went from 72 up to 77. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but Georgia had a 20% advantage in pass defense as of the SEC championship game. And today they have a 10% advantage. That's a big jump, guys. Like Georgia was giving up under 30, cutting your passing game down by 30%, which was huge. Now it's down to 20%. And that difference is enough for like a field goal. It's not massive, but offenses and passing games tend to get what they get. And we talk about that a lot. It's hard to really slow one down on a consistent basis. Now, they are often inconsistent by nature, but it's not inconsistent like tailored to how good the opposing defense is. It's just some days they have good off days and some days they have on games. Hence, like Auburn result versus the Georgia result. But it does start to matter. And so I think it's interesting that our model does favor Alabama more now than Georgia. 1 field goal, but Alabama by a field goal over Georgia. And the spread actually went in the other direction, even after Alabama won the prior game handily. And I think that's one of the more bizarre, frankly, outcomes that we've seen for a while. I've been trying to wrap my head around it all weekend. We record these late on Sunday, just so people know. So Alabama 29, Georgia 26, changed from Alabama, Georgia 28 all, Georgia getting 2 points less, Alabama getting an extra point. But by and large, these are still the same teams. And the model with just 2 extra games, the model is going to view these teams as being what they are. And I think that's the right way to do it.
And it's interesting to me because like you said, Vegas went in one direction and our model went in the other. But the one thing that our model doesn't do is account for injury. And this is where I get into my score prediction. I think that Alabama's injury situation is still unclear. But I'm concerned when I see 40% of this offensive line go down in a game and not return, and thinking a week later they got to play Georgia. And that it's been an offensive line that's been up and down all year. I do think that Georgia's going to come heavy with the blitz, and I think that Alabama's going to expose that a couple of times. I don't think that's enough to win a ball game. And I really, really believe that Stetson Bennett is good enough to win a national championship. People forget in the fact that he threw 2 interceptions. He was throwing interceptions because he was pressing, because that defense was giving up score after score after score. He still put up 340 yards. And he still dropped dimes to Bowers that kept the ball moving. And we haven't even really talked about what matchup disadvantages there are when you have corners that aren't super experienced. And you said that you're not that concerned. You haven't seen evidence that there's a drop off or that they're bad. But this is still going to be Kyrie Jackson's second game ever, right? So I've got Georgia 27, Alabama 24, which is funny. I laughed earlier when you said Vegas has this as a 27-24 game, because that's where I've got it. Which, look, This is coming a lot closer. I think I picked Georgia by 10 in the last game. I think Georgia wins this game, and it's really because I don't know about Alabama's injury situation. At some point, it feels like every year at the end of the season, every time an Alabama player gets hurt, they're out for the year. It's so weird to me. They're out for the game, they're out for the year. Everything is so significant and so severe. And for that, I just think it's too much. We're talking about a Georgia team that's going to send 17 guys, I think I heard earlier, to the NFL. If Georgia doesn't win this game, I've got concerns because this is their shot. This is Alabama's rebuilding year versus Georgia's like super senior, super everything. Like they're going to take a step back next year. I think they win the game. I'm not shocked at all if Alabama wins the game. I just think that at some point, the injury situation becomes too much, even if you're Alabama. We saw it in 2019. We really saw it in 2017 for 30% of the season. That's my score, but again, I'm not shocked if Bama wins it. Give me yours.
So my score in this game, I'm going to say 30-27 Alabama, and we're floating around the same number, right? And we're talking about a touchdown either way. I think Alabama finds a way to get a score, probably, if you want to say it, probably due to the fact that they played Cincinnati. And something we haven't even talked about, mostly because there's a lot of things. Look, there's guys like, is Pickens going to be a huge factor? Well, one, I don't assume so because he had caught one pass for 9 yards in the last game, caught one pass in the game prior. I'd be surprised if he's suddenly a huge part of the offense, but we don't know, so we're not going to talk about it that much. One of the things we really can't talk about is how much did either one of these teams prepare for the other in bowl prep. I have a feeling that Georgia really had to prepare for Michigan and take that game seriously in a way that Alabama probably had the luxury of not doing. And in particular, Michigan is in no way resembles Alabama in how they play offense in a lot of ways. And the way you attack Michigan is totally different. I think Alabama had the luxury of playing a team that likes to be power run and could probably sneak in prep for Georgia. Now, both these teams have a million analysts, and in terms of coming up with a brand new game plan, that's going to happen. And Georgia is going to be able to probably to adjust more because they had more to adjust from. But in terms of getting players ready, I think Alabama has a little bit of an advantage. And I'm just saying that advantage might be enough to lead to one extra scoring drive. That's it. And that's how tight I think this game likely is. It does not shock me if Georgia wins. But here to me is the problem. This is the difficulty for Georgia. If you look at that SEC championship game and 41-24, and all the noise was about the 41. It was about the fact that Alabama put up a ton of yards, threw for 9.6 yards per attempt, yada, yada, yada. My concern for Georgia coming into this game is not the 41, because I think there are paths for them to hold Alabama to a lot fewer points. My concern for Georgia, really more than anything, is the 24. This is a team that's averaging, a lot of points on a daily basis, right? What is their scoring offense? It's 39 points per game. And so if you get a team that has 39 points a game, you hold them to 24, you're doing pretty good. And in that Alabama game, it was 7.1 yards per for Stetson Bennett, 2 interceptions thrown, 3.6 yards per carry. And a lot of that would have looked worse if it wasn't for Bauer's heroics late in the game. I don't know, for all the talk with everything Georgia's going to do defensively, this is really the point I want to end on. I don't know what Georgia's going to do different offensively. I think Alabama has the opportunity to correct some of the stuff that Georgia exploited them with in the last game. I don't know what Georgia's counterpunch is. Do they want to throw more vertically? Maybe if there's an injury situation, they're going to test that to see if the corners work, but it's not what they like to do. And so my problem with this game is I struggle to see how Georgia is going to have a good path to get 30, because I still don't, Alabama's just as healthier in the front seven. They're still a monster to run on. Again, they're second in the country in rush defense. Georgia's third. And I'm going to have to see a passing game from Stetson Bennett that I really haven't seen to date for me to think they're going to put up a ton of points. And if they're held to the low to mid 20s, even the LSU game, when Alabama was completely lethargic, the center went out, everything went to crap, Alabama scored 20. And so that's going to be a really, really hard game if Alabama knows they got to hit 25 to 30 to keep them from hitting that mark. And that's why I lean towards Alabama. But I certainly don't have a ton of confidence in it. And I do think this game is very likely to be much more of a struggle than the last one, particularly because I will be shocked. And I think it would be coaching malpractice if Georgia does not bring a lot more pressure and go for broke. And my thinking of having seen Alabama is it's likely to be fairly effective.
Josh, putting our numbers hat back on, because we've done a lot less numbers and more matchups and, that kind of discussion. If Alabama runs for 4 yards a carry, do they win?
I think if Alabama runs for 4 yards per carry, they likely won, yeah.
And that's to your point about having a healthy Brian Robinson versus, losing Mechie. And I do think that a lot of people see that the production fell off with Mechie going out, but also that's when Alabama started sitting on the ball with a big lead. So maybe there's something there. But I agree. I think if Robinson doesn't show up to be that kind of offset for what they lost at wide receiver, and he runs for 2.5 yards a carry, that's where I think Georgia wins the game. I think because I do not believe that Bryce Young is going to be able to exploit enough a heavy blitz. The other thing that I was thinking that I'd like you to maybe touch on is we saw Georgia throw very effectively to the running back. We saw one situation where Alabama had a punt against Georgia where if it was a ball that was batted down to Brian Robinson, if he had caught it, he'd have run for 40 yards. And that was early in the game when they were down 10-0 or whatever. Is there a situation in this game, because you talk about running back depth and saving running backs? This is it. This is the last game. So for all the issues of running back depth, it might not be a problem in this game because it's the last game. Could you see a situation where they throw to the running back more, kind of like Georgia has done, to sort of counteract that blitz? It's not something they've shown a lot all season long, but you talk about doing something different in this game. Is this something that you could see them doing against Georgia?
It's possible. I mean, everything's on the table. Now, the problem, this is the same problem we talked about, like running your offense through a tight end, right? If you're doing one thing, you're not doing something else. If a problem we had years ago with Jalen Hurts and their offense is every Jalen Hurts run, as effective as he was at like a 5+ yard per carry guy, he was often running by scrambling instead of throwing the ball. And that means you don't throw it downfield, which means you lose opportunities to be explosive. I think you're reticent to throw too much to the backs in this game because Georgia's linebackers are exceptional. And Robinson is a really good back, but he's not fast enough to outrun Dean or even Walker consistently. And you feel like you have a matchup advantage at receiver and you want to take advantage of it. But to your point, there are probably some plays out there that you can do to the running back just to kind of keep the blitz slowed down. I think they will probably try to lean more on the wide receiver screen game more than anything. Because the problem when you bring a blitz is if you bring a blitz and there's a receiver screen, it's one missed tackle at that point and you likely have somebody at the house. I mean, if you've brought a safety and then you've got, nickel and corner on slot and X or Y, you're in a situation now where you often have a one-on-one and there's nobody to help. And you've got a speedy guy on the outside that if he breaks a tackle, you don't have leverage anymore. It's a touchdown. I think that's probably where they'll lean, but they're probably going to have to be a little more balanced in those things. And to your point, let me spin it more. I think the bigger advantage for Alabama is I think Bryce Young has probably done a lot of stuff to protect himself this year, in part because Alabama knows if Bryce Young goes down, their team is done. We saw that a little bit from Ole Miss. When Matt Corral went down against Baylor, that offense went into the toilet. And Altmaier made some good throws, but he also made some bad throws, and he was certainly shook for a while. I don't know that Alabama has a backup as good as Altmaier, frankly. And so they have not or they've probably told Bryce Young to get away from pressure, make something happen, throw the ball away. I think they're going to be more than happy to face the blitz, and I think Bryce Young is probably going to be more willing to sit in the pocket and throw in pressure and take a shot than he has been. And I think that's probably the more likely thing is you aren't trying to preserve people from injury. you're going to be more willing to run Robinson into the ground or to take hits on your quarterback and do things that sort of go into facing pressure. Whether that works or not, I don't know. And that's, again, one of the problems that happens when you have a team that hasn't had to play a certain way. Now they're going to try to. Does it actually work? I don't know. I really feel like both these teams are going to be playing a style of football that neither one of them have really played that much this year. Georgia's going to be a lot more pressure heavy. Alabama's probably going to be a lot more risk taking than they've been in most points. And it makes for an extremely unpredictable ball game, frankly.
All right, so I'm going to close this out, or have you close this out with one final discussion about Georgia quarterback situation. I am the founding member of Team Stetson Bennett. And I think that their best chance to win this game is with him, or Georgia's best chance is with him. If we get into a situation like 2017 where Georgia is down, not doing so great, let's say it's 17-7 at the half, I am of the opinion that it would be a very bad decision to go to JT Daniels. I think he would be terrible against this Alabama defense. I think their best chance to win and their only chance to win is with Stetson Bennett, and I've got them winning this game. In your opinion, do you agree, for all the Georgia fans that think they've got this thing on the sidelines that nobody's thinking about that can come in and win a game for them because he can stress a defense, do you agree or disagree if it's 17-7 at the half and they put JT Daniels in the game that it's actually worse for Georgia than it is better for Georgia?
I think it would be a mistake. I mean, at some point you have to make a change, just because if you don't make a change, you're destined to lose. And coaches that want to win a game are coaches that frequently get blown out, because it's like the going for it on fourth down thing, right? It increases your odds to win, but it also greatly increases your odds to lose by more or badly. But my thing with Alabama in this particular set of matchups, Stetson Bennett is a better player at escaping the pocket, at using the tight ends, at basically keeping drives alive. His wheels are an asset. It changes the way Alabama can blitz them and rush them. It kind of keeps the pressure off to a good degree because Alabama can't be more direct. Also, Bowers was the most effective option Georgia had in that first game. And now you can say that's because of Stetson Bennett, but I don't think that's really true. Alabama's had trouble over the middle of the field, especially with tight ends and misdirection stuff, all season. And that's where Bennett shines, is delivering an accurate, timely football in those situations. Misdirection plays, because you can run bootlegs and you can roll them out, and that lets you run a lot more misdirection stuff and hit those tight ends, which is attacking the linebackers and safeties. If you wanted to attack deficient corners down the field, then you'd put in JT Daniels. But the problem is Alabama has a really good pass rush, which I'm not sure Georgia's very well equipped to handle. I'm not sure anybody is. And I don't think you want a stationary target versus Anderson, because they can be like Cincinnati had the advantage of having a very mobile quarterback, and Alabama didn't get a ton of pressure because they were worried about containing him. You let them attack a guy that isn't very mobile, and I think you're going to find Alabama can generate a lot of pressure really quickly. And the other thing is, maybe you find Alabama's corners are struggling, and so maybe it's a good idea, but you've got to have time to throw deep. And then if you do throw deep, you got to be getting wins. And I just don't think Georgia's corners on Georgia's receivers on Alabama's corners are the good matchup. I don't think you want to be playing around with Alabama's pass rush with a not mobile quarterback. And to me, end of the story here for all this talk, if Georgia can run the ball for over 4 yards a carry, like 4.5 yards a carry, to where they have the ability to throw in 3rd and 5 and let Stetson Bennett do its thing, that's where they want to be. They need to get the safeties not over the top. It doesn't matter if you got Daniels or Bennett. If Bama can sit in 2 safety, you can't throw over the top because the safeties they have are good and rangy and they will close on the ball. You've got to get them down in the box. You've got to get them uncomfortable. You've got to get down in distance. And then not only are you moving the chains, but then you get this counterpunch they had against Michigan the whole game, like we're talking about before. You get the ability to get the explosives. And that's the game. I mean, that's the game really is, we said it on the other side, right? With Alabama, can Alabama continue to hold up against the pass rush and get some explosives? But on the Georgia side, can they run the ball? And those two things, as basic as they are the whole game. And I don't think neither one of those things is dependent upon the Georgia quarterback. So I think people that say if we only had JT Daniels are really missing the boat, because that's not the matchup that's going to determine this game.
And I'll also say that I think with JT Daniels, you might get more wins on the outside with the deep shot, but you're also going to get more losses. I think that he is more turnover prone than people realize. And yes, Stetson Bennett has thrown some interceptions against Alabama trying to claw his way out of a deficit. But that's different from being able to lean on a defense when you're in an lead advantage. I think that JT Daniels trying to claw out of a hole is going to throw a lot of interceptions and be, like you said, under a lot of duress. And Stetson Bennett makes this offense click at a highly efficient rate. It's really down to the fact that your defense doesn't need to give up 5 scores in a row. If Georgia doesn't give up 5 scores in a row against Alabama, Stetson Bennett does the same thing he did against Michigan and they win the game. So it really comes down to the point, and this is where we close it out, is to your point, does sending 5 or 6 get home enough to keep enough pressure on Bryce Young that he gets the yips again like he did against Auburn, like he did against LSU, and like he did for half the game against Cincinnati? If that's the case and that happens, then you're probably going to beat Alabama. If nothing else, it's a closer game and it's in doubt in the fourth quarter. Closing it out, last question, and I know we've run long, and I thank y'all for staying this long with us. Josh, if Alabama has 14 to 17 points in the first half, do you think that means they're probably going to win? Meaning, that means that blitz, that putting pressure on Bryce Young hasn't completely flummoxed him like it did in the Auburn LSU games.
I think that's probably fair. I mean, the late game, because of Georgia's depth at running back, is probably going to favor them more than people realize. And Alabama's going to get tired. Georgia, their offense goes through the run a lot more than Alabama's does. And so as Alabama gets tired and Georgia can run the ball well and stay in good down and distance, they'll be effective down the stretch. But to your point, I think you're going to have a pretty good idea in the first half. Because if Alabama is able to put up 14 or 17 early while Georgia's defense is fresh, then that means their offensive line's holding up, and that's probably going to continue. Both these defenses are going to struggle more in the second half than the first half, more than likely, because that's the way, again, Baylor, Ole Miss, same thing that happened, right? Defenses get tired, and they start playing worse. And so Alabama, by all rights, should look worse than Georgia early on because of the pass rush issues. If they can handle them right at the jump, you're going to kind of know how it's going. The line for Alabama, it's not a coincidence because of how the way the game broke, right? The breaking point for Alabama is really second quarter to third quarter. That's where they want to win the game. Georgia wants to win in the first and fourth. They want their defense, when it's fresh out of the gates, to be dominant. They want to run the ball and put it away in the fourth quarter. And Alabama wants to win it in the second and third. And so that should be the game you end up getting.
All right, y'all. That's it for us. This was actually a lot of fun. We went wire to wire, just talking football, just talking sport, and it was a lot of fun. So let us know again if you like this format, because we may do it again next year. It's kind of like our live show, so it's fun in that regard. Don't forget to give us your score prediction. We will talk to you in the comments, and we are not done for the year, I promise. We've actually been talking about something that's pretty fun, that's completely out of our comfort zone. That's going to be coming soon. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great championship week, and God bless.